that was just plain weird. And,
that was the idea.
Yeah, and I asked Steve to deliver weirdness, and I think he really did. And so now what I'm sure of is that there is all of you are in a kind of superposition of questioning mode, which is to say that in all of your brains there's 5 or 10 different questions, and you have to just arrive at one of them and start asking. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands when you have a question that you want to bring up, and I will scurry around like a rodent and bring this to you so that you can ask the question, and then I will look around for others. I see one here and one here.
Hi, and thanks for your talk. I heard or read within the last week, I believe, something about a phosphorus atom transistor. I don't know if I don't remember the discussion about it other than that idea. Now, my sense of a transistor is it's something that can have one of 2 states, and I'm wondering just exactly what's the meaning of changing the state of an atom? I mean, and not to mention reading the state of an atom. I can't wrap my mind around how do you look at an atom and tell what state it's in, and how do you change its state?
So I'm also familiar with that work. It was done in Australia, actually, and this is one of the groups that's really trying to push towards the real quantum computer. And the idea is they take a single phosphorus atom and embed it in a solid. And one of the properties of atoms is they act like little magnets, what in physics we call spin. And so essentially you can imagine this phosphorus atom having a north and south pole, and it's either spin up or spin down. And that's what's going to store my quantum information. And then the challenge is, of course, to be able to manipulate that. So to build a quantum computer, you have to be able to tip the spin in whatever direction you want, and you have to be able to measure the spin. And so the way they on that particular system, they have ways at which you can change the flow of current that's related to the direction of the spin. And so it's almost like an amplification process where they can get out a signal that's large enough that I can tell what it's doing, but even though it's related to a single atom.
It's fine if you have one atom suspended in the middle of a large space, but in reality you're going to have a gazillion phosphorus atoms, and how do you manipulate
Well,
one at a time?
so if everyone didn't hear that, he's asking, it's a great question. So we do a lot of experiments, say at the JQI, where we can suspend a single ion in the middle of an empty vacuum chamber and talk to that guy. So what about this phosphorus atom? It's around 10 to the 20th other atoms. Well, what they've been working on there is actually being able to specifically take a single phosphorus atom and stick it in the middle of something in a place where they know where it is. So it's what's called a dopant. So I think it's silicon is the substrate. And so they're trying to go in one at a time, put a phosphorus atom here, phosphorus atom here, phosphorus atom here, and then hook up leads to them and read them out.
I'm going to just ask a really stupid question, because that was really heavy, and I want to get stupid.
Right.
And then we'll get heavy. But I'm just thinking, when you tell your students that they can't be sure there's objective reality, I'm thinking, did they stop caring about grades? Forgiveness.
I'm just curious what you guys do every day at the Joint Quantum Institute.
Why?
What do you do every day?
Why are we doing everything?
No, what do you do?
Oh, what do we do at the Joint Quantum Institute? So the Joint Quantum Institute is this joint thing between NIST and University of Maryland, and we're studying things related to quantum computation, as I suggested there at the end. We're also looking at ways you can communicate. So one of the other things I didn't talk about related to cryptography is I can hide my information quantum mechanically so that even if you intercept it, you can't tell what it is because of the rules of quantum mechanics. And in addition, a lot of what we do is just fundamental physics. And I'm proud that we do fundamental physics. Not everything you do has to relate to a product or everything. If you look at a lot of the advances in society, it comes back to us just our natural curiosity about physical systems. And what's really changed from when the guys were doing the quantum theory in the 20s is we now have just these exquisite experimental tools where we can really go in and trap a single ion in the middle of a vacuum chamber. We have lasers. We can manipulate things with the kind of control that Einstein and Bohr and Schrodinger, their jaws would have dropped. They never would have imagined the kinds of things we can do now.
Yes. Can you define measurement from a quantum standpoint? Because clearly, it doesn't really matter if a conscious being is on the other side of the measurement.
It's a good question. So this has been something that has bothered people ever since the foundations of quantum mechanics. Basically, this idea, if you say, I only can predict things probabilistically, and so I only get an answer as a result of the measurement, then does somehow the human consciousness come into it somehow? So what's a measurement? And that's actually at some level still a little bit of an open question, but we've developed a sort of way to think about it, which is that as you get to bigger and bigger systems, they tend to act more and more like classical systems. I mean, you've all got 10 to the 24 atoms in you. You don't look quantum mechanical to me, right? And so if a measurement is taking my little individual quantum system and connecting it to some big complicated thing, it then turns it into a classical thing. So that's really our sort of modern viewpoint of measurement theory now.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You said you don't look quantum mechanical to me, and at the end of your talk you said the world is classical. But is that really the case? All living things have evolved through changes to their genetic material, say DNA. And the changes in DNA are typically single molecular events, quantum events, you might say. So isn't it striking that the evolution of all life on Earth has been driven by fundamentally indeterminate quantum events, which are then eons later shaping the geography of the whole planet? So surely that puts a stake through the heart of determinism, philosophical algebra, isn't it? Or am I missing something?
No. It's an interesting insight. So, as physicists, we learn to be reductionist, right? So what we want to do is break things down smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And that's how we get down to the describing an atom and the physics of an atom and quantum mechanics. And so quantum mechanics does describe the individual, base pairs in DNA, but those individual base pairs aren't sitting there in isolation. They're in the soup of the rest of the goop that's in your cells, right? And so, although I could specify exactly what's happening between two base pairs in a quantum mechanical terms, if I really wanted to do it right, I would have to take into account that DNA is interacting with 10 to the 10th other water molecules and proteins or whatever. And very quickly, it starts to look classical. That doesn't mean that quantum mechanics isn't still the correct description. It's really that classical is just a much better shorthand, because the things that are really weirdly quantum mechanics kind of very quickly get washed out. There is some very interesting research that's looking into whether there is something really quantum in photosynthesis. And so it really actually does look like potentially there is sort of a real world room temperature kind of quantum effect where when a photon of light hits a cell that is going to do photosynthesis, that you kind of have to bring quantum mechanics in it to understand how it's going to convert into energy.
I was hoping I could stay in order, but I'm not going to be totally in order. Forgive me. Also, I just want to encourage you, if you are so inclined, you can identify yourself in any way you might want to. It's not an obligation to the next person.
Hi, I'm Kim. I was just hoping you could briefly discuss the relationship between shape theory
That was so that was.
Do you want a tougher question?
That was briefly discussed string theory, quantum mechanics, and relativity. Can I say no? That's a tough one. So pretty much what I talked about today was really sort of low energy quantum mechanics. I'm worrying about atoms and things. As you increase the energy, you have to start getting to high energy physics, and you start getting into questions about the birth of the universe and everything. And we still don't have a way to kind of unify everything. Remember I said there was a little asterisk, quantum mechanics is perfect, except it doesn't agree with gravity. So one thing that Einstein and pretty much everyone who goes into physics wants is the theory of everything, POE. You'll see it abbreviated sometime. And we don't have that at the moment. So what's missing is how to connect general relativity and quantum mechanics together. At the moment, they're incompatible with one another. String theory is a mathematical attempt at that, which, to be honest, I don't really understand. It has yet to make predictions that can really be tested in the lab. So in some sense, although some of my string theory colleagues would probably be offended if I say that, it's still mathematics, not physics necessarily. But it's making a lot of progress. So I'm afraid that's about the best I can do on that brief question. Right.
Hi, I'm Daniel. So you were saying quantum mechanics is more like a theory of our knowledge of the way things work rather than how things work per se. But
Right.
you also said it portends that there is no objective reality. But to draw that conclusion, are we necessarily making an unjustified leap because it's a system of knowledge about how things work instead of how things work?
Well, yeah, so it's, I guess the way I would say it, if you look at what Bell did, he was talking about what we call tests of local hidden variable theory. Sounds pretty fancy, right? So the local just means, let's assume causality, no time travel, so we can forget that. Hidden variable theory says that, all right, I told you quantum mechanics, when I do measurements, it's going to be probabilistic. The idea is that, well, there's some hidden objective reality, some hidden property of the thing that I don't know about, but that's actually what's determining the outcome. And the tests that Bell came up with that have been verified over and over again are there is no hidden theory. So that's really the basis that I can't say that, all right, I just don't know what the thing is that I'm looking at, but somewhere there really is an objective reality. That's what Einstein correctly identified that as what he saw as the incomplete part of quantum mechanics. And what to him was incomplete was he had to give up objective reality, which he didn't like doing, you know, so. Yeah, so, you know, when we get into discussions sometimes about, you know, because you sort of get into some philosophy and things as to why it is that way. It's a very interesting question, but quite often the response we give is just shut up and calculate. Because when you do that, you always get the right answer. And so, in a sense, the big question, which is sort of the philosophical question, is why is that the way quantum mechanics is? And we don't have any answer whatsoever as to why that is the way it is.
Hi, I'm Randall, and I barely understand what you're talking about. But if you could you humor us and give us some rationale or explanation as to why quantum mechanics and gravity are incompatible?
So quantum mechanics and gravity, by gravity we mean general relativity. So this is Einstein's theory of gravity, are incompatible. I'm not sure that I can really give you a very neat answer on that. General relativity is probably a lot harder to understand than quantum mechanics, actually. And it really has to do with treating the gravitational field as warping space-time and the like. And I'm not sure I can really do justice to why it is. So special relativity, which you may have heard of, that's when things are going near the speed of light, you know, time slows down and things like that. That's okay. That we can incorporate in quantum mechanics. That's called quantum field theory. But it's when you really try to bring in kind of the weird aspects of warping space-time with general relativity that it just is inconsistent. Not that people aren't working at it. I mean, people have been working since Einstein's day to unify them.
Okay, so going back to this question about objective reality, let me ask it a little differently. So let's say we're trying to measure something like the mass of a gold. Make a measurement, make another measurement, make another measurement. These measurements don't all exactly agree with each other. But we think maybe we're just not being accurate enough. There is an actual mass of a gold atom out there, and we're just not quite there yet. So is what you're saying is there actually is no such thing as the mass of a gold atom. All there is measurements.
In some provocative sense, maybe we could say that. All that really exists is a set of measurements. Perhaps a better way to see it is, let's say I take that gold atom and I'm going to make a superposition of it being here and here. And we have experiments where we can send atoms through slits and diffract them in ways that their wave function, which is what quantum mechanics describes things as, is a lump here and a lump over here. No objective reality says that that wave function is really just me saying what I know about the system. It's not that the atom is really here and here at the same time, because there isn't any real. The real is my set of measurement records. It's a very strange thing, but it's the consequence that comes out from the mathematical theory.
Just two details about the guy who just asked the question. Maybe part of I'm telling you this, but it's his birthday, and he taught me organic chemistry when I was 19.
Well, happy birthday. So did he learn organic chemistry? Or?
Very well.
Okay, all right.
Could you tell me the difference between the particle being in superposition states and there being an equal probability of the particle being in one set of states? Because when you're talking about the blue and the red ball into one in the pocket, before you take the ball out of your pocket, there's an equal probability that it's all blue and red, but you don't say that the ball is superposition colors.
Right, so for me to create a quantum superposition, I have to do something fairly specific. So, blue and red ball, I'm never going to be able to make a true quantum superposition because they're too big, they interact with too many things. But I can take a single atom and I can apply some, say, laser field to it and give it a kick to the left and a kick to the right. And so then its wave function will split up into being here and here at the same time. And so that's the superposition. And I guess what I'm really just trying to say is if I try to write down, so in the end, the wave function is the description of nature. And so I can have a set of wave functions that are superposition states of the ball being left, the ball being right, or the atom over here, or the atom over here, or a photon with polarization this way or polarization this way, for instance.
But what is the difference between that and there just being an equal probability of the particle being in one?
Yes, that's a good question. Essentially, it comes down to interference. Yeah, so I could just say the particle's here with 50% of the time and it's here with 50% of the time. But I can do experiments where I interfere the two pieces, and in the quantum mechanical case, I'll get fringes where I wouldn't if they were 50-50. So we actually have experimental ways to tell those two things apart. And so what we really want to say is our state of knowledge of that particle is that it's simultaneously in these two places. And if I go to measure it, it's either here or either here.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at the beginning of this, you described the theory of quantum mechanics as being invented rather than being discovered. I was wondering why you chose to describe it like that.
Why it's invented rather than discovered. I'm not sure that I draw too much distinction between those words in this context. It was it was a process. It basically, if you really look, Planck made his first stab at what became the quantum theory in 1900. Einstein 1905, Bohr 1913, the real full theory in the 20s. So it was the way our scientific process generally works. We observe nature. We try to create a model to describe nature. And what was difficult, I think why it took 20 years for them to develop quantum mechanics, is because it was very radical. So up until the 1900s, the most successful theory we had was electricity and magnetism. This was developed by this guy named James Maxwell in about 1860 or so. And this was fantastic. It took electricity and magnetism, said they were part of the same phenomena, waves, light. It just kind of tied everything together. And if you looked at that theory, you looked at the mathematics of that theory, it was all these smooth, continuous waves and fields. And so the step that Planck took, why he called it was an act of desperation, is he was living in the world where everything was continuous. And the most successful theory up to that point was continuous. And all of a sudden, you have to start breaking it up into these quanta. And so whether it's an invention or a discovery, it's really an iterative process between experimentalists making measurements, theorists trying to develop theories that can explain those measurements. And in the end, I think this is important to understand when you think about controversies in science. It's like a good analogy is it's a jigsaw puzzle. It's not a house of cards, generally. So you can't go and pick and choose things. So what you're trying to do is build a complex, consistent view of nature that you have the mathematics that describes it, and I can go off and do a measurement, and you can plug that into your model and see whether or not it agrees. So you can't pick and choose the pieces. So it's a big organic evolution, which in this case took really about 20 years to be fully fleshed out. So whether you want to call that invention or discovery, it's a little bit of both, I think.
First off, forgive me if this isn't actually consistent with quantum mechanics, but
You have to.
Suppose we set up a situation like going back to the sending two quantumly entangled particles in different directions, and if we measure the spin of one, we know the spin of the other. So suppose we set up a situation where we measure the finite distance that the particles have traveled from the origin, and we also would want to measure whether or not the superposition has continued, if the superposition state has changed based on interference with other particles in the field we're talking about. So now that would make our knowledge of the superposition, we couldn't be certain if we chose a finite distance because we have measured this finite distance. So since our knowledge of the superposition has become uncertain, then it breaks that ball under a cup scenario in which we know instantly because it's two things happening, and if we know one, then it must be the other by logic. So since that uncertainty is created, how does quantum mechanics respond to that? What? Yeah.
So
see if you can recast that.
I'm not sure whether I can or not, but I'll just answer a different question. How about that? I'm in Washington after all, right? So, but what I'd like to say is, and what you have to remember is that the act of measurement or interacting with a particle messes with the quantum state. So I mentioned collapse of the wave function. So I create a superposition through whatever means. I can't just willy-nilly go and measure something because after I've measured it, I've changed the state. It's what we use fancy terms like back action and things like this. But basically it means that it's very difficult to extract a property of the quantum state without having screwed up the quantum state. If I go and measure it again, I'll get the same answer again because I've collapsed the wave function to a value. So when you're thinking about these entangled systems, in a sense, you're not really allowed to look at it until you want to do the measurement. Because if you look at it, you've changed the quantum state, and then it's a different problem.
Just going to switch gears slightly here and ask you a bit of a question about you, if you don't mind. Just kind of wondering if there was some moment, some teacher, something you read, something in your experience that directed you into physics, that grabbed your attention, particularly to quantum mechanics.
So both of my parents were chemists. So I knew I didn't want to do chemistry. So probably if I had to say, I could identify two people, my high school physics teacher. So this is a good plug for good high school physics teachers, of which I see one in the room here, right? Yeah. Or maybe a couple. And also one of my physics professors, and what was special about him, which I would love to be able to emulate it the same way he could, was that he would present a problem, and you'd say, I don't really understand that. And he would just come at it from a completely different direction and give you another completely different direction. And perhaps those two things, what it really was, I went to college. I said, gee, physics sounds like fun. I'll be a physics major. And I started doing it, and I loved it, so I just kept going.
Hello. I'm a social scientist, mostly economics, and I'm interested in what you say about reduction, in the sense that people are saying that, and pretty soon we'll be able to look at people's brains, and I'll be out of a job. But then the chemists think people who are the neurologists, well, that's just aggregate chemistry, and the physicists think the chemists are just aggregate physics. But then when you go down to the physical level, someone like Niels Bohr has that instrumentalist interpretation that all physics really is just looking at the mathematical properties of observed objects. So you compare this thing you see, that thing you see, and electrons don't actually exist, it's just the mathematical relationship. But that's exactly what we do at this high level when I'm looking at behavior. So I'm wondering exactly how the reductionist paradigm will interact with this idea that there actually isn't anything down there to stand on.
I've always said everything is physics. So this is the complete reductionist view. I don't know if I want to say economics is physics, but I guess at the bottom level it is. So these ideas of questions of objective reality and everything, those don't actually really impact in any way, because we've developed a very successful mathematical underpinnings of the microscopic world that explains everything quite well. I think the maybe more interesting question, and this comes back to biology, consciousness, behavior, is this idea of, if you take a very complex system and I tell you, I know exactly how particle A acts with particle B and particle C acts with particle D, etc. Can I predict the overall properties? Can I decide it makes me crave McDonald's French fries? And we don't really understand that. I mean, I guess my view is, at some level, one could always reduce it, but that's probably not the best way to understand complex phenomena. In other words, at some point, I'm better off thinking about a human having, say, behavior characteristics for economics than I am trying to, look at the carbon atoms in the brain to figure that out. But it is a continuum, and I think perhaps the big revolution in the next 50 years is as we really start to understand the brain better and connect it down more to the microscopic level.
So I have a question about weirdness. In your experience as a physicist, do you see the weirdness being a characteristic of the observable world that you're exploring, or does the weirdness come from limitation of human faculties to understand things that are extremely dissimilar from what we commonly encounter?
So to be honest, the more you do it, the less weird it seems. But I understand where you're coming from. In a sense, what's weird is how it doesn't connect to your everyday experience, right? Because again, we live in the classical world. But as I said, if you're doing this every day, what seems weird to you, to me, is like, well, it's the way it is, kind of thing. And so at some point, at the bar, we can sit and argue about why it's that way, but that's not productive for us to get our work done during the day. So maybe we've gotten slightly jaded about it all, but you know, you have to move on, kind of thing.
Hi. You said that Bell proved that we can't have causality and objective reality. How do we know that it's objective reality that's wrong and not causality?
We don't. And so if you want to keep objective reality, that's fine. So in a sense, the reason that we tend to give up objective reality is, I think, you just run into more issues. You know, there's that whole time travel when you go back and, you know, kill your grandfather or something, what happens. And that you start getting, you know, going off in some really weird path when you give up causality. So there's no a priori reason why I should give up one or over the other. It's just that we tend to think that you're going to run into more problems. I mean, after all, giving up objective reality doesn't really hurt me in any way. It's kind of fun, you know. It's liberating, right? Giving up causality is perhaps a little more difficult to deal with.
I have the mic, and I actually will ask another question, but I want to get someone else. Anybody? Good. I had a real specific sort of question. When an electron moves from one energy level to another in the Bohr atom, is it known how much time it's taken in that transit from one level to another, or is that even a relevant question?
That is a relevant question. In fact, just in our class last week, we were teaching the students this question, and there's been some breakthroughs in lasers where we can actually kind of answer that question, and it's a very short amount of time. It's attoseconds, which are 10 to the minus 18 seconds. And there's actually been some recent measurements that have tried to look at that. So.
A billionth of a billionth of a second?
Yes, right.
Billion.
Damn fast.
Can you say that like Carl Sagan?
Billions and billions, right? Yeah.
Question over here.
My name is Ben Stein. So quantum computers are portrayed as kind of a holy grail, and another Ben Stein, by the way. If one of them is built, practically one of them is built, they'd be instantly able to factor these huge numbers that you showed, which are the basis of encryption codes. But in the slide that you showed of Peter Shor, it said that for n-digit number, it takes n to the cube steps to factor it. So wouldn't banks just start using million-digit numbers and then slow down computers and in quantum mechanics? Yeah.
So it's all about scaling, as we call it. So n cubed is polynomial. So if you go back to your math class from high school or whenever, right? It's just a little exponent that's 3, so I cube something. So that grows fast, but not that fast. Exponential scaling, which is where we live in the current world, grows much, much faster. So remember, I doubled the number of digits, and I increased the difficulty by a factor of 10 to the 12th, right? Where if I doubled the number of digits when it's n cubed, it's only a factor of 8. And the other thing is, cryptography is a practical thing, so if I have to start using million-digit numbers, it's going to slow things down. So I should point out, too, that a quantum computer is not necessarily a general-purpose computer that we're all going to have quantum computers in our iPhones in 20 years. It has certain problems it's really good for, and factoring is one of them.
So I do notice the checks are coming around. Make sure that you are kind to your servers. The one thing around this room working really hard.
In your answer to this young man's question over here earlier, you talked about measuring the act of measurement could change the outcome of the state, if I understood what you said. Is that equivalent to saying that observation in any form also can change the outcome of the state?
Yes. So, in fact, one of the challenges, if we want to, say, build a quantum computer, it has to be composed of thousands, maybe tens of thousands of individual, let's say, atoms. We can think of them as our little bar magnets. And I have to be able to go in there and manipulate them, but they also can't interact with the environment. And interacting with the environment is essentially observation. It's not whether I observe it, it's whether anyone observes it, because you start mixing in all these other possibilities and it very quickly falls apart. So again, if you think about quantum mechanics is a theory of our knowledge of nature, then the fact that the act of measurement does something to the state makes complete sense, because when I measure it, I gain knowledge of the state, and so I've changed the knowledge of my state. I think there was one up here.
With all this indeterminacy, is there any relationship to Gödel's incompleteness theorem?
I don't think that you would really make any connection with Gödel's theorem. That's really sort of addressing things in a different direction. So I think the answer is no. I don't know what more to say than that, actually.
Mine's just a follow-up on the whole measuring things.
Mm-hmm.
Is human consciousness and observation, is that even tied into quantum mechanics anymore, or is that an old thing?
So it's an interesting question. There have been a number of people who have tried to, and some respectable physicists, in fact, who have tried to somehow build in indeterminacy in quantum mechanics as being something to do with how consciousness develops in the brain. I think that's not a very well accepted view on things, again, because the brain is this very complex thing. So there's kind of two questions. One is, does consciousness have anything to do with quantum mechanics? And, well, I don't understand consciousness, so I can't say for sure. But if I want to take my reductionist hat and say the brain is just, a bunch of neurons that are firing electrical impulses around, it's hard to see how there's anything quantum mechanical about that, because it's sitting there, room temperature, you got your blood flowing, it's going to be very classical. But the question, which maybe you were aiming more, was whether I need to consider consciousness in defining what a measurement is. And not, well, you can, you can't. It's a little vague. But I mean, we sort of have a good description now that says if I take an isolated quantum state and let it interact with a big complicated system like the outside world, that state superposition collapses. And so that looks like measurement. And I never had to say anything about consciousness. The interesting thing is, and this is where it gets kind of fun, is when I said that, I sort of drew a box, right? I said, here's my system, and here's the environment out here, right? So why did I draw the line here? Why don't I draw it out here, or maybe the entire universe? And now I've got a wave function that describes the entire universe, and where's the measurement? And I don't know.
You said earlier there was some interesting recent research showing the likely relevance of quantum effects in photosynthesis. Doesn't it therefore seem a little hasty to suppose that it couldn't be involved in other biological processes, including the operation of the brain? After all, I think probably photosynthesis is being studied in this connection because of its importance for energy production and the possibility that you could make better ways of using energy from sunlight. So photosynthesis has been studied in inordinate detail, and yes, they found evidence that superposition might be of central importance in how photosynthesis works, but that doesn't mean that anybody has looked for it in other biological processes and concluded that it's not there. I think nobody's really looked very hard, at least they haven't looked as hard as they have at photosynthesis.
You're certainly right, and perhaps I was too harsh to dismiss the role of quantum mechanics in biology, but I would say that what has been seen in photosynthesis is just sort of a little glimpse of some quantumness for a very short amount of time. What they're really doing is trying to understand how these cells efficiently harvest the light and convert them into essentially chemical energy. And to kind of get agreement with the rates that are measured, they have to assume that a little bit of what we call quantum coherence, which is, you can imagine, a superposition hanging around for a picosecond or something, is necessary to get this result. So that's a ways away from it being sort of central, I think. But, they're complex systems.
So you mentioned that the name photon took about 2 decades to catch on. Is that right?
That's correct.
Were there any other contenders? What other names?
There were. Einstein just called it a light quanta, which was not too thrilling. The interesting thing is there was one of the other contenders was the neutron. And that would have caused all kinds of confusion. But at the time that was the contender, the neutron hadn't been discovered yet. So to remind you, the neutron is the neutral particle in the nucleus. It was actually, the photon was coined by a chemist, Gilbert Lewis, who, if you actually, I recently went back and looked at the paper where he effectively coined the term, and he had a totally botched theory about photons. He thought atoms had bunches of photons in them and everything. So he got lucky. He got to keep the name even though his theory was wrong. And of course, it's been popularized by Star Trek and photon torpedoes, right?